Welcome to CSGuitars, the science of loud. You may have heard the terms British and American being used to describe the sound of an amplifier. When this terminology is applied to clean sounds, it can largely be summarised as Vox versus Fender. But this is a gain appreciation video, and we want to talk about distortion. What makes a distortion sound British, and how is that different from an American distortion? Originally, the separation of these sounds comes unsurprisingly from musical differences between Britain and America. Bands traditionally would have a very different sound on either side of the pond depending on their influences and backgrounds, as well as what equipment they had available. Most electric guitar equipment originated in America from the 50s onwards, and due to the difficulties and expense of importing equipment across the ocean, British companies had to sprout up to meet demand of musicians here. Marshall, for example, began producing amplifiers because British musicians just couldn't get their hands on the American-made Fender amplifiers. Marshall started off with direct clones of the Fender amps, but quickly started to incorporate their own modifications and designs because the British public demanded the amps sound bigger, louder, and meaner. The sound that British musicians wanted to hear was quite different from the sound that American equipment made, and that feedback shaped the progression of British equipment and the British sound. We can think of British distortion as the sound from amplifiers like Marshall, Orange, or Laney, and while these brands sound different from one another, they do share some common themes. They are all really ballsy with a pronounced mid-range, a big, loose bottom end, and a distortion that would saturate as they got louder. British amplifiers regularly use EL34 or EL84 power valves depending on their wattage, and these have a nice soft distortion when driven loud. You can take an old Marshall and roll everything to 10 and it'll still sound great, largely for this reason. The distortion sound was also thicker, nastier. The British distortion sound was loud, in your face, and not at all apologetic about it. With American distortion, what springs to mind are amplifiers like Peavey or Mesa Boogie. These are very different beasts. More clinical, with a bit more scoop in the mid-range, tight bass, and a lot of highs. While aggressive, this sculpted character can sound thin in comparison to the British sound. American amps are more likely to feature 6L6 power valves, which have a lot more clean headroom, so won't saturate as easily, giving them greater dynamic range. This provides precision, particularly when playing low, heavy riffs. They do sound a lot harsher when driven hard though, so racking an American amp to 10 isn't necessarily the best thing to do. The texture of the distortion is considered to be smoother and more cutting. The American sound has a certain cleanliness, perhaps even sterile quality, making it the antithesis of the rude sounds from across the ocean. While American distortion makes an incision, British distortion leaves you with lacerations. Of course, all of this is sweeping generalisation, and there are plenty of amplifiers on both sides that completely defy these trends. However, it's these same generalisations that have come to rest in the terms British and American distortion. Of course, the real reason that these terms exist is more to do with legality than anything else. As digital modelling has become more prevalent and many smaller manufacturers have got into the amplifier market, companies need a way to say that their amplifier model sounds like a Marshall or like a Peavey without actually using those brand names. When describing the sound of an amplifier that you've created, saying something like heavy British rock is a legally distinct way of saying it's a Marshall 800. Similarly, American metal is a common way to get across the idea that it's a Peavey 6505 without incurring a lawsuit. That's why when you go to Victory's website and read the description of the Kraken amplifier, you'll see that they've described it as having a classic British-inspired channel and an aggressive American high-gain channel. What this is trying to communicate is that gain 1 is loosely based on a Marshall 800 and gain 2 is more like a 6505. Those two amplifiers, the 800 and 6505, are probably the most well-known distortion sounds in all rock and metal music and are the distillation of British and American distortion sounds respectively. Stick on any metal album from the last 30 years and you can almost be guaranteed that one or both of these amplifiers were used on that record somewhere. Even if the bands don't use these amplifiers live or don't have an endorsement deal with those companies, they're probably still being used to track with in the studio. These two sounds are a bit like Celestion Vintage 30 speakers and SM57 microphones in that while technically maybe not the greatest, damn do they work and get you the sound you're after effortlessly, so end up being used on the majority of heavy metal recordings. Walk into any studio the world over and it's a likelihood they will have an 800 and a 6505 sitting there ready to be used. If you want to record heavy metal music, these are an ideal place to start. And that's why the Victory Kraken is such a fantastic amplifier. You're getting both of those sounds in one conveniently transportable lunchbox package. Mine has EL34s in the power section as my preferences lean more towards the British sound and I don't require the additional headroom provided by 6 L6 power valves. As this amplifier is sort of designed around the fact that the British sound is more of a rhythm channel and the American sound more a lead channel, there's a lot more distortion on gain too, so I'll be doing my best to balance those levels. Also, using an overdrive pedal like the Tube Screamer into the front end of either of those channels is a very common trick for getting a little bit more ferocity out of either of the sounds, and I'll be doing that here. Hopefully you'll have been able to hear how much larger the British distortion sounds in comparison to the American sound, which features a more streamlined, aggressive quality. Both sounds have their merits and show their strengths when used in certain styles of metal music. For example, if I'm playing an Iron Maiden or an Ozzy Osbourne, I prefer the British sound, but if I was doing a Bullet for My Valentine or a Trivium, the American sound sits better. The American sound is particularly beneficial if you want to retain that tight, focused quality when using low tunings. British distortion tends to be a filthy, untamed wall of sound when you're drop tuning, which might explain why the likes of Mastodon and Slipknot use orange amplifiers extensively to get their sound. Both work, just in very different ways. There is no right answer here. Both are extremely useful sounds and even work very well when tracked together, so having access to both is a perfect way to get excellent metal sounds. If you are wanting to get both of these sounds in a convenient package which is relatively inexpensive, then you really can't go wrong with the Victory Kraken. Sweetwater and Thomann affiliate links are in the description underneath this video if you want to grab one for yourself. Also, remember to click all the buttons that you're supposed to make this video viable to the ever-changing whims of the YouTube algorithm. But that's all for now. Keep it loud, and I'll see you later. Alright, governor, Harry Potter, fish and chips.